Hello, my name's Dave Smallshire. I'm a volunteer with the British Dragonfly Society based in Devon. I'm the county dragonfly recorder for Devon, and Stover Country Park is a local site for me and one that I've visited for over 35 years, recording its dragonflies and other wildlife. This presentation is an introduction to the dragonflies of Stover, dragonflies in general, and also how we're going to be monitoring them in the next few years, following some quite considerable work going on in the park, notably dredging part of the lake. So it's aimed at young volunteers who've come forward and hopefully committed themselves to learning about dragonflies and helping to monitor them over a 3-year period and perhaps beyond. This presentation comes in 3 parts. A lengthy section initially about the general biology of dragonflies, then a section on how we go about monitoring dragonflies and what dragonflies occur at Stover, and then finally the identification of the regular species of dragonflies and damselflies, i.e. those that we're likely to see in the course of most years. So why are we interested in dragonflies? Well, for a start, they are important at Stover. They're part of the justification for Stover Country Park being not just a local nature reserve, but also a site of special scientific interest. They are a beautiful and, I would say, very exciting insects. They're very photogenic. A lot of people like to take pictures of them because they're so lovely. And they are actually quite a challenge to identify. Some people enjoy that challenge, of course. As insects, they're big. They're bigger than most insects, and that makes them relatively easy to study. They have a unique mating behaviour, which I'll describe shortly. They're predatory, both as larvae in fresh water, where they live for a year or more, but they're also predatory as adults, catching mainly winged insects, so flies, moths, butterflies and so on. Most species will indicate the health of a water body, a pond, a lake or a river or stream. They're also good indicators of climate change. They're cold-blooded, so they're responding across the world, in fact, in the light of increased temperatures, and they're also being affected by changes in rainfall patterns, but particularly changes in temperature with our warming climate. They're ancient insects. They're one of the first insects to appear over 300 million years ago, and indeed they were well in evidence by the time the dinosaurs came along. Here's a representation, an artist's impression of a fossil dragonfly, or what that fossil might have looked like in real life. And the basic wing shape and the basic form of the dragonfly was there then and can still be seen today over 300 million years later. These early ancestors of dragonflies had large size enabled by a higher oxygen content in the atmosphere, and some of them had wingspans that equal those of birds of prey like a kestrel, for example. So those wings are incredibly complex, wonderfully evolved to enable them to fly both forwards but also up, down and backwards and sideways. Astonishing things to watch. So The odonata, as dragonflies are generally known in the scientific world, are split into two basic groups: the larger dragonflies or Anisoptera and the smaller, generally weaker flying damselflies or Zygoptera. So the odonata means the toothed ones. They have jaws that enable them to capture and eat their prey. That gives them their scientific name. And those dragonflies, an example there on the right is the emperor dragonfly, one of our largest species, shows the general form: head, thorax with wings attached, and then a long abdomen sticking out behind. And you'll perhaps notice that those two front wings are a different shape to the hind wings. And once they're emerged from water and flying around, dragonflies will always keep their wings out at 90 degrees roughly to the body. Contrast that with damselflies below, and the damselflies hold their wings together over their back. Generally, in most species they hold them together occasionally, and in some species they will hold them a little bit apart. But also notice that all those four wings are exactly the same shape, unlike with the dragonflies. So yes, they're an insect. They can be divided into three parts: the head, which is dominated by those huge compound eyes that give them wonderful eyesight; the thorax, which has not just the wings attached, but underneath 6 legs. All insects have 6 legs. And then the abdomen, which is divided into 10 segments. And then right at the tip, there are appendages, which I'll describe the reason for later on. So here's a closer look at the emperor dragonfly with the head, thorax and abdomen with those 10 abdominal segments and these quite long appendages in the case of this species. There's also a spot towards the tip of the wing. It's technically known as the pterostigma, but that literally means wing spot, and wing spot is quite a good name. The damselfly here, another species that occurs at Stover, the small red-eyed, has the same basic divisions into head, thorax and abdomen. It also has the wing spots and those rather smaller appendages. And then just behind the head and at the front of the thorax is a plate known as the pronotum. I'll talk a little bit more about the pronotum in damselflies in a while. So dragonflies are wonderful flyers. They have very strong wings, much stronger than they appear to be at first sight. They look very delicate, but in fact they are very strong. They have those huge eyes which are used for detecting prey, potential partners, males looking for females perhaps, and also rival males that may invade a male's territory. The front of the head or below the head, we can see those powerful jaws that it uses to eat its prey. The legs are armed with almost a basket of spines that are used to help catch prey and bring it up to the mouth parts to be eaten. And at the tip of each leg there are 2 very strong claws that give them an amazing grip, and also occasionally can be used for tearing the wings of other dragonflies, rival males perhaps. The wings, as I said earlier, are incredibly strong, and they're helped in their strength by being rather three-dimensional. They have very strong veins, particularly across the front of the wing, and then cross veins that give them strength. you'll be able to see on some of the veins little hair-like features which are used as sensory hairs to give the dragonflies a clue as to what their wings are doing. Bottom left you can see that wing spot, the pterostigma there, and along the front of each costa, the front vein on each wing, is a break known as the node, and that actually helps to give the wing a sort of break point. It enables them to bash the tips of their wings without completely damaging them. So they have that little flexible break point. It's thought the wing spot helps with stability during flight and helps them particularly with their fast maneuverable flight. Now, I mentioned that dragonflies and damselflies have unique mating behaviour, and this shows a pair of common blue damselflies mating. And to help explain what's going on here, I think we need to understand the differences between males and females, which isn't all that easy with insects generally. So males have accessory genitalia or secondary genitalia under the base of the abdomen. Underneath segments 1 and 2 there's a cavity with actually in effect a second penis inside. So as Sandy Toxvig will tell you on one episode of QI, dragonflies are the only organisms in the world with 2 penises. Anyway, there's this swelling that usually marks the presence of the secondary genitalia, circled there. Here you can see, even in this emerging 4-spotted chaser, that it is a male. It has this cavity underneath the base of the abdomen. And in this blue-tailed damselfly male, we can see that swelling underneath the base of the abdomen. So this is a clue, obviously a good clue, to tell us which sex of dragonfly or damselfly we're dealing with. Females, however, have an ovipositor under the tip of the abdomen, and in many species it's quite obvious. In the damselflies there on the right, there are swollen areas which are used for laying eggs, and on the bottom left we've got a southern hawker with a sickle-shaped ovipositor that is pressed into rotten wood, for example, to lay eggs. And just to the right of that, a golden-ringed dragonfly with a long protruding ovipositor. So all damselflies, all hawkers and golden-ringed dragonfly have ovipositors, and these are used for laying eggs into plants or debris, and those are shown by these bulges. All the other dragonflies have eggs which come from what's known as a vulvar scale under the tip of the abdomen. These are dragonflies that will dip the tip of their abdomen into water to lay eggs rather than injecting them into plants, for example. So female abdomens contain eggs, which they are going to be laying, maturing and then laying. So they have broader abdomens. And there I've shown both a female and a male to the left of it, blue-tailed damselfly. And you can see how slim the male abdomen is for most of its length, bulging at the base for those accessory, those secondary genitalia, and also towards the tip, which is where the sperm are produced. whereas the female has a rather more evenly parallel shaped abdomen. And so the thick abdomen, along with an ovipositor in many species, is a good clue to females. Towards the tip of the abdomen, I mentioned that there are appendages, and in males these take the form in damselflies of 2 upper and 2 lower appendages, which are used to grasp the pronotum of females. So the pronotum is that shield at the back of the head that I mentioned earlier. And these are designed specifically to fit the shape of the pronotum of the females of their species. So that theoretically stops them from interbreeding. Dragonflies grab the females in a rather cruder fashion. They have 2 upper and 1 lower appendage, and the males in flight will grab the back of the head of a female dragonfly of their species, hopefully, not always, but usually, and then they will mate by the female bringing her abdomen to couple up with the male's secondary genitalia. These show the pronotum. So on the left there, that's a very simple shape to the rear edge, perhaps a little more complex in the emerald damselfly on the right. But to be fair, it is hard to see the shape of the pronotum, and it's one that's used particularly in warmer areas, in the tropics, for example, where there are lots of very similar damselflies to separate, and the shape of the pronotum, and in particular their appendages, is a good clue. The male's appendages is a good clue to the species identification. For most of our species, we don't need to worry too much about this, thankfully, at least in Britain. The first step in mating involves this coupling up between the male and the female, so the male grasping the female, and we call this the tandem position, so they can fly around indeed in tandem, and this you will often see. If the female wishes to mate, she will curl her abdomen forwards so it joins up with the male's secondary genitalia, and then we get this mating wheel, or if you're romantically inclined, you can think of it as a heart. So copulation can be very rapid, just a matter of seconds in flight, or take a longer period, often around about half an hour, where they will perch. And in the case of the blue-tailed damselflies on the left, it can be several hours. Someone has timed them up to 6 hours mating. So that does mean it's worth knowing that they mate for a long time, because blue-tailed damselflies are the most likely species for you to see mating, particularly in the afternoons or late afternoon when they often couple up. When they've mated, the female will want to go and lay eggs, usually immediately after copulating. So the eggs will be laid either into plant material on the surface, or just below the surface, or even quite a bit below the surface. Males of some species, some of the damselflies, will stay attached, and also some of the dragonflies too, but in others the females will lay alone. The common blue damselfly is a species that will often go underwater for some period of time, and the females, as they go under, take a film of air with them, which enables them to continue to breathe underwater. They're breathing through little holes, little spiracles in the side of their body, and they can use the oxygen they take down with them for that purpose. Usually the males will let go and leave the females to lay their eggs alone. And a bit later on, when the females try to emerge, they will often find difficulty getting through the surface tension of the water, so the males will patrol over the water low down looking for females, and if they spot one, they will grab hold of her and haul her out and take her back to shore. And to be fair, they will often expect to mate after rescuing the female. So it's one of the ways that they can actually get a female to mate with. The emperor dragonfly likes to lay eggs by standing on plant material on the surface of the water. Golden ring dragonfly we saw earlier on with that very long protruding ovipositor will actually bounce up and down like a pogo stick into the water and repeatedly stab its ovipositor into the base of streams and boggy areas that they frequent, each time laying an egg. So emerald dragonflies, chasers and skimmers, will lay eggs by just dipping the tip of their abdomen into the surface of the water, sometimes into the damp margins, sometimes with the males attached, sometimes without. Darters usually will stay linked up, whereas the skimmers, chasers and emeralds will egg lay alone. So let's not forget that dragonflies and damselflies spend most of their lives in the water. The eggs that are laid will hatch within a few weeks, or occasionally in some species, for example like the emerald damselflies, they stay as eggs over winter and will hatch in the spring. But quite often eggs laid during the summer will hatch a few weeks later. What comes out of the egg is like a tiny little tadpole, a pro-larva that is designed really for just breaking free of the egg, and within seconds or a minute will molt into a tiny larva, or nymph as they're often known. These larvae grow via a series of molts, like caterpillars do, for example, growing each time they shed their skin. Often about a dozen molts in the case of dragonflies and damselflies. And towards the end of their development, their wings are visible as shrunken, folded up wings within sheaths on the top of their abdomen. So the larval development usually takes 1 or 2 years. Those emerald damselflies that spend the winter as eggs and hatch in late winter or early spring will actually be ready to emerge in about 10 weeks. So 2 or 3 months' time, they will have fully developed and are ready to come out of the water as adults. But at the other extreme, there can be several years, up to maybe 5 or 6 years, in the case of the golden ring dragonfly, which is not only big, but also lives in waters where food may be scarce. So that takes them longer to grow. So yes, I re-emphasize that most of the dragonfly's life is spent underwater, and the larvae take 3 basic forms. Damselflies are all basically long and thin and will have generally 3 little tails. Dragonflies come in 2 basic forms, long and thin like a torpedo, let's say, or maybe short and fat, rather spider-like. So those three forms in life look like this. So damselfly is long and slim with these three external gills, and they use those actually to help them to swim along, although they can swim by wriggling alone. Even if they lose them, they can continue to breathe through their skin. The hawker types, the torpedoes, are long and relatively thin. They're mostly active hunters, as are the damselflies, and they can also escape from danger by squirting out water from their rear end. The spider-like darters, for example, short, squat. Some of them live in mud or sand or organic debris at the bottom of a pond or even a slow-flowing river. So we've got those three basic types that will give us a clue to the species. But we can, from those different shapes and forms and sizes, we can try and identify the different species as larvae. When they're fully grown, they are ready to emerge. They spend a day or two near the water surface looking for places to climb out and on which to emerge, which is very often a plant that's emerging out of the water or on the edge of the water. Sometimes it will be a plant or even a tree, or sometimes stones or bricks or a wall some distance away, a metre or two even away from the water's edge. But most will come up plants coming out of the water. And over the next 2 or 3 hours, they will slowly emerge from their larval case. They're very vulnerable at this stage. They're a good tasty morsel if you happen to be a bird, for example, looking for food to feed to your chicks. But even ants and spiders will attack them. So because of the predation risk, the big larvae, the torpedoes, the hawkers and emperors, will emerge mostly during darkness and fly away at first light. And they will leave behind their exuvia, the larval skin. So by redistributing their body fluids, the thorax swells and splits, and the adult starts to push itself out. It will hang back until its legs have hardened off, and at that point it will lunge forward quickly and use its legs to grab hold of its larval skin, and it can then pull out its abdomen. And again, it's redistributing its body fluids to expand its abdomen first, and then its wings. And any excess fluid it will eject through the rear end. And the final stage in emergence is to spread its wings, and at that point they will stay spread for the rest of its life. In the case of dragonflies, as I mentioned right at the beginning, they hold their wings out at right angles. And you can see there underneath this emperor dragonfly, you can see its rather big exuvia, the larval skin, and we can collect and identify those, and we can find out roughly how many are emerging from a water body in this way. So they are in many ways the perfect tool for monitoring dragonflies, although quite difficult to find, and some are quite difficult to identify. But they do give us absolute proof that a species has bred at a particular water body, and that's really useful information from a conservation point of view. We have the same process taking place in damselflies. but these emerge during daylight, often during the mornings when the weather is fine and sunny and hopefully not wet and windy, which can be a problem to them if the weather changes while they're emerging. But damselflies don't bend backwards as the dragonflies do. They just lunge forward, I suppose, slowly, and then withdraw their abdomen. As I said earlier, we can collect both larvae and exuviae and identify them, and this field guide can be used literally in the field using the actual sizes, the lengths. You can place an exuvia right next to those blue bars on the right hand side and have a stab at what it is just purely on size. But there are other key characteristics that you can look for. The lamellae, those tails on the damselflies, for example, the shape of the head, the colour and the patterning, although you will need hand lens or in some cases a microscope to be sure of the identity. Here's a couple of images of a damselfly and a four-spotted chaser after emergence. Now, because these are lacking in colour or patterning when they first emerge, they can be really hard to identify. Occasionally you'll get a clue. It's actually easier to collect the exuvia and try and identify it from that. But when they first emerge, they have generally a very soft, weak body. The wings are still retaining liquid, so they're very reflective. And they have very weak flight as they take their maiden flight from water. Their wing spots remain pale for a few days, and it will be over a period of days, even weeks in some cases, before they get their full adult colours. So as an example, this is a relatively rare species that has only rarely been seen at Stover, but the scarce chaser emerges here in this first example, showing its very reflective wings. It hasn't yet taken its maiden flight, this one. It will colour up within a day to look like this. So a distinctive pattern showing now. And then over a period of weeks it will mature and go dull and look like this. Males, in contrast, will after a few days or maybe a week start to change quite dramatically. There will be a blue substance, waxy substance, comes through the abdomen and coats it, so covering up that orangey yellow coloration, and they will end up looking like this. This one we can see has a few markings part way down the abdomen. These are scuff marks from the legs of a female, so we know this one has actually mated. The females will hold on as they couple up. Old females of dragonflies sometimes take on the colours of males, and this old female, we know it's a female because she has short appendages, widely spaced, and in the case of the male chasers these are longer and held together, so we can actually sex them even if we can't see the colours of the body. So there we can see the changes that take place, and these are common across many species of dragonfly and damselfly and create quite a bit of confusion, particularly when we're seeing young or teneral specimens, immatures which have yet to produce, yet to mature and produce their full coloration. There's also a bit of confusion at times with female damselflies. in particular because the females come in different colour forms. Some which will be the same colour as the males, and these occur particularly when there are high densities of dragonflies. But you can see the blue-tailed damselfly here has on the left a pinky red form and this rather violet form. And sometimes these are immature forms and the colours will change as they get older. So all potentially rather confusing. So what sort of clues will we focus on to try and identify dragonflies and damselflies? Well, one basic thing, particularly if it's a dragonfly, is it perched? And does it zoom around and come back to a perch? So is it a percher, or is it patrolling a piece of water? Is it flying around? Is it a flyer? So the hawker dragonflies, the emperor dragonflies are flyers. The chasers, the darters, the skimmers, these are perchers. What time of year is it? Is it an early emerging species? So is it one that we're only likely to see in spring? Or does it emerge after midsummer and is still on the wing in the autumn? So those year times will give us a clue. So there are what are known as phenology charts in field guides that help you to gauge when you might be seeing a certain species. Look at the maps. The distribution maps will also give you a clue. Bear in mind that even though there may be colouring on a map to show that a species may be present there, the precise habitat, particularly for scarcer species, may not be. So they're the habitat specialists, so those that really like a very particular type of habitat, won't be in some rubbishy old pond or a polluted watercourse. But just beware that species like the demoiselles, the golden ringed dragonfly, the scarce chaser that occur on running waters will often wander away from running water, a kilometre or more sometimes. And we also have habitat generalists, things like the common blue damselfly and the common darter, that will often wander away from water and could turn up almost anywhere. And then there's something that birdwatchers will know all about. It's what's called the jizz. It's something that you learn usually over years of exposure to particular species. You learn certain little characteristics about the way things move, about the way things fly, about the way they behave, and that helps very often to identify almost instantaneously, but you will need a lot of experience to do that. How do we watch dragonflies? Well, the most important thing in Britain is to watch them as adults when the weather is nice and warm. So on a calm, sunny day, this is perfect. If the temperature falls below about 17 and the wind starts to get up, then you will see far fewer. The best conditions are around the middle of the day, so you have roughly 6 hours to play with, provided the weather's good, of course. When you're approaching dragonflies and trying to look at them and judge their colour, make sure, if you can, that you've got the sun behind you. Otherwise, you will be looking at a silhouette against bright water. And what's quite important with these creatures that have very large eyes and therefore good eyesight is that you don't disturb them. They're very good at seeing a large human being approaching them. So try and avoid, at the very least, casting a shadow across them, because that will make them fly away. They don't like pale or brightly coloured clothing, so try and dress somberly, and most particularly avoid sudden movements. it's those rapid movements that the eyes will pick up, and they will respond accordingly by flying away rapidly. If you've got access to close focus binoculars, then they are a brilliant aid. So things that will focus down to 2 or 3 meters will enable you to get a really good view of the critical features that you use to identify them. If you've got a good camera, or any camera, try and take a good photograph, and you can zoom up the image if it's in focus, and again check those critical features. And you've also got a permanent record of what you've seen and when it was. And there are field guides available and online resources. The British Dragonfly Society's website has good identification resources, and as I say, use a good field guide, and this happens to be one of several available. Please note down your sightings. Do record what you see. It'll be very important for us checking on the populations of dragonflies at Stover over the coming years to know exactly what we've got, and ideally with some indication of what's breeding, so noting sightings of exuviae that we've found, and correct identifications, or even just describing what you've seen and identifying it later. But please make a record of things. Okay, so now let's have a look at the species that we're likely to be seeing at Stover. To put it into context, we have actually rather few species in Europe, and about a third of those occurring in the UK. So maybe around 6,000 or 7,000 species globally, mostly in the hot tropical regions, and many fewer in the temperate regions of the northern hemisphere especially. So we have less than 150 species breeding in Europe, and 48 of those, nearly a third of them, in the UK. So 25 species have been seen at Stover over the years, and 20 of those breed. 8 of them are damselflies, and a dozen of them are dragonflies. So let's have a look at what they are. The damselflies, we've got those 8 species underlined, 2 that haven't been seen for several decades at Stover are on the red list, and I have to say we're unlikely to be seeing those ever again at Stover. But the underlined ones, those 8 species now breed every year, and we should be able to see those without any trouble. The red-eyed damselfly is locally important, so in a Devon context that species is notable. And there are our dragonfly species, again the underlined ones are those which breed annually. 3 of those are purple, so of local importance, but only 2, the hairy dragonfly and downy emerald, are known to breed at Stover. Scarce chaser has turned up in the last few years and may be a future breeding species. That's our only red-listed dragonfly, so that's one of the rarest and most endangered species in Britain. And then we have a couple of occasional visitors. So dragonflies are quite powerful, and they do migrate or wander. So red-veined darter is a known migrant species that we see very occasionally. Again with the ruddy darter, possibly the same migrant status, although they do and have bred in the West Country. Black darter has also bred on at least one occasion and turns up periodically, but it's most likely a wanderer from moorland, from places like Dartmoor, so it may have flown some miles down from the hills of Dartmoor, for example. So just summarising the status of Stover's dragonflies and damselflies. So I reckon we could call 4 species, 3 of them damselflies, as being abundant. So these are species that we may well see in their hundreds, if not even thousands. Common species, certainly present in tens, maybe hundreds. We've got rather more species, 3, 4 of the damselflies and 6 of the dragonflies come into that category. And then we have 5 scarce species. So 2 early summer species, the hairy dragonfly and the downy emerald, or rather spring species. The keeled skimmer, rather uncommon, appearing in the summer. And then we have 2 that breed on running water, so the Ventiford Brook skirts the edge of the park, and we have those 2 species, the demoiselle and the golden ring dragonfly, breeding there. As I said previously, we have had a breeding record of black darter, and then these 5 other species which are rare. These are all dragonfly species, and then we have those 2 old records of rare damselflies that we are unlikely to see again. So that will just give you a rough idea of what you're most likely to be seeing and what you're least likely to be seeing. So during the 3 years, 2023, 24, 25, we will have a concerted effort at recording the dragonflies at Stover. This will be principally to monitor the effects of dredging part of the lake. Now that map shows orangey brown areas where the dredging is going to occur, and that hatched green area on land is where woodland has been cleared, conifers have been cleared, and the land has been prepared to put the sediment from the lake onto. So it will be put into geotextile tubes and allowed to dry out, and subsequently there will be trees planted on that area. So that dredged area will be one of the focal points of our study. However, the rest of the lake, and in particular some of the ponds around the lake, we will also be looking at. So we want to try and make sure that the species that are breeding in the park as a whole are maintained, if not enhanced, as a result of this dredging. So we'll be doing detailed recording on a site-by-site basis going around the park. We'll be looking for what's there as adults. We'll be looking for any breeding evidence, so those copulating pairs or egg-laying, ovipositing pairs or females. If we happen to find any larvae, then we'll record those. Certainly we'll be looking for some exuviae and recording those, and we may see some evidence of emergence, which is also very good evidence of breeding, of course. But in addition to recording those different life stages, we're also going to be trying to put numbers down, and we have to realise that actually trying to get accurate counts of dragonflies is a bit of a nonsense, as it is for all insects. They are extremely difficult to try and put a number against to get a population estimate of. And so we will be estimating the numbers that we'll be seeing at each part of the park as we go around. So all of this is in the name of trying to clean up the water in the lake. It has undergone many years now of sediment input into the lake, sediment that comes from off the site, so possibly as a result of treated or maybe even untreated sewage coming in to the lake. Also fertilizers that have come from farmland, and possibly also pollutants that have come in the past from the A38, the dual carriageway that runs right next to the park. So these are the sub-sites, the recording areas that we'll be focusing on. So you can see there are 12 principal sites and several sub-sites that we'll be looking at. And these have each been given a coded number and name. Numbers 1, 2, 4 and 5 are what are known as the SUDS ponds, the Sustainable Drainage System ponds, and these are quite recent, still developing, and have taken the water off the A38 in 2 locations, and they will be cleaning up the water before it enters the lake. Site 3 used to be, well, is still a sedimentation pond, so it's just off the main inlet channel, which is number 6, and is periodically cleaned out and sediment is removed from it. Again, that's tapping the water before it gets into the lake at point 7A. So we've got these areas 7A and 7B, which are rather sheltered parts of the lake. 6B incidentally has a series of cascades down it which help to oxygenate the water as it comes into the lake. So these are all in the name of trying to clean up the water in the lake. So the main body of the lake is number 12, and we have these other sites, number 8, 9, 10, 11, which are around the lake. 10 is the outlet stream, so it's directly connected to the lake. And 13 is a channel that used to be a long thin lake extending southwards out of the park. So you'll have maps of those to work with, and we'll familiarise ourselves with these sub-sites over the summers. Okay, so we're now going to look at the identification of the dragonflies and damselflies at Stover, of the species that we're likely to see every year. If you want to take a break at this point, please do, but if you don't, we'll carry on. Now we can divide our damselflies into 6 basic types, and indeed the dragonflies at Stover fall neatly into 6 basic types as well. So the blue-tailed damselfly, which, yeah, it has a blue tail, also has other features. The blue damselflies, which we've got 2 species of, which can be rather confusing. We have 2 red eyes, which we need to be able to separate. We have the large red damselfly. We only have 1 species of red damsel, so that's relatively easy. And we have only 1 species of emerald damselfly, which holds its wings out, so that's relatively easy. And then typically along the Ventiford Brook, but also wandering across the site, the beautiful demoiselle with those dark wings. In terms of the dragonflies, we have chasers, skimmers and darters, which are all perchers. So these are the ones that like to perch either on a twig, a stem, or on the ground, and then fly up and chase things. Then we have the hawkers and emperors, which are flying around all the time, it seems, and rarely landing. The golden ring dragonfly does this, but generally over running water. and perches rather more frequently. Finally, the downy emerald, a real speciality, a difficult species to see, very hard to see perched, mainly because they go and sit up in the treetops. But they also fly around as males and behave as flyers, so the males patrol the edges of the lake and ponds. Okay, so let's look at these in more detail. First, the damselflies. So the first damselfly to emerge in spring is the large red, and by mid-May these will be present in good numbers, and towards midsummer the numbers will be depleted. There'll be just small numbers of them by midsummer. Also during April and particularly in May, the azure damselflies will emerge, and you'll see these in the ponds, particularly around the edges of the lake. The beautiful demoiselle will also be emerging and flying around in May. And then by late May and into June, the red-eyed damselflies will start to appear, and these we'll see mainly perched on pondweed, floating vegetation out on the lake, and to a lesser extent on some of the ponds. The common blue damselflies will also be out in abundance from May onwards and reaching their largest numbers, sometimes hundreds or thousands of them over the lake, particularly during midsummer. Blue-tailed damselflies will also be fairly prominent then. And then as summer progresses, from late June onwards, we'll start to see small red-eyed damselflies. So they're emerging about a month later than the red-eyed. And the emerald damselflies, which are the latest ones to emerge. Some maybe from the end of June onwards, but these will be present in good numbers, particularly in July, August, September. So let's have a look at these now individually. The large red damselfly, here's a mature male. I stress that because they don't start off bright red. They turn red over a period of days. They have black legs, black wing spots, and also some black markings, shiny black markings towards the tip of the abdomen. Red stripes on the thorax as well, and red eyes. The females come in three basic colour forms, one of which is mostly red, one of which is mostly black, but the common one is this typical form with quite a lot of red and a fair amount of black on it too, and even little bits of yellow. And you can actually see, if you look closely, that her eyes are banded. She has dark stripes across her eyes. So these are common features of spring at Stover. The azure damselfly, or the snooker player as I like to call them, I'll explain why the snooker player in a moment, is one of our commonest blue damselfly species. Indeed, over the spring and early part of summer, and certainly around the smaller ponds around Stover, this is the abundant blue damselfly, and the one that you'll often see laying eggs in tandem. So it has, first of all, a narrow blue stripe on the thorax. That's where your binoculars comes in handy, because looking through binoculars you'll be able to see that that blue stripe is narrower than the black below it. It has a black marking on that 10th abdominal segment, so it does look a little bit like a bow tie or a dicky bow. Can you see where the snooker player starts to come in? Snooker players often wear a dicky bow. And although you may not appreciate it, it's carrying a beer glass like many snooker players do. That square U shape on segment 2 is distinctive. Not easy to see, so look first for the narrow blue stripe. There's also on the side of the thorax, again you've got to use your imagination a bit here, but think of that as the billiard cue, that of course the snooker or billiard player would also carry. The blue-tailed damselfly does what it says on the tin. The males have a largely dark abdomen with that blue segment 8, but they also have a wing spot that's black and white. So the males have quite a black and white wing spot, especially on the forewings, the front wings, and that's unique in the damselflies at Stover. So there's a blue tail, as it were. These are quite small damselflies, and here are the various, well, two of the various colours of the females. The one on the left also having a blue tail. They don't all have blue tails. There are some forms which have a dark brown, a very dull segment there, which is quite hard to see. So again, look at the wing spots and you'll see not black and white in the females, but dark grey and pale grey. So this particular form of the female has got the blue segment towards the tip of the abdomen. And there's what I call a two-tone pterostigma, or the wing spot that's got two tones, black and white, or dark grey and pale grey. And as I mentioned earlier, you will often see blue-tailed damselflies mating late in the day, often in numbers. So if you see paired damselflies at that time of day, think first of all, are they blue-tailed damselflies? Because they very often will be. The other species tend to mate and lay eggs mainly in the morning, to a lesser extent in the afternoons. So the blue-tails mating very often late afternoon and laying eggs even into the evening. The common blue damselfly is the other common blue species of damselfly, but there are some really quite good differences between them and the azure. First of all, the side of the thorax doesn't have a billiard cue. Neither the male or the female has the billiard cue. In the azure, both male and female has that billiard cue. The male has broad blue stripes on top of the thorax and a very narrow black stripe underneath it. So remember, the azure has a narrow blue stripe and a broad black one. The tip of the abdomen has two entirely blue segments, so no indication of a black dicky bow shape. And the segment 2 marking is actually an apple or mushroom shape. It may look sometimes a little bit like the black U shape of the beer glass that the azure has, but if you look closely you'll see it's actually part of the wing veins that give you that side stripe. So as I said earlier, not easy to see these segment 2 markings. You're much better to focus on the thorax. Let's just reiterate this. Here's our azure, our snooker player with its billiard cue on the side, its beer glass on segment 2, and the narrow blue stripe. And here's the common blue with its mushroom or apple shape, the broad stripe, and then the lack of a billiard cue, the lack of a dark spur on the side of the thorax. And then at the tail end, you can very often see those two completely blue segments on the common blue. Females are a little bit more confusing. They tend to be black and bluish or pale green, though they do vary in colour. Particularly in the common blue, there are three base colour forms, so you'll have black markings on blue or olivey colour or even a brownish colour. But note again the width of those stripes on the top of the thorax. So again, even the females are easy with these, if you can see that. The side of the thorax, has it got a billiard cue or not? And then look at the black markings on the abdomen. And those of the common blue look like rocket shapes. So can you imagine a moon rocket shape with a pointed top and those fins on the side? So different shaped black markings on the azure. As I stressed earlier, the base colour is variable. The beautiful demoiselle is an easy one because it has these pigmented wings. So dark wings, completely dark in the males. They're large damselflies, have a very conspicuous floppy flight, typically found beside running water, but does wander. The females also have pigmented wings, but brownish in the case of the beautiful demoiselle, and she has a white wing spot. So although they may have emerald green bodies, those dark wings will tell you straight away that it's a demoiselle. The red-eyed damselfly, yes, it's got red eyes, but it's not always easy to see that. They're one of the two red-eyed species that like to be out on water, on floating vegetation, pondweeds, lily pads. They both have blue tips to the abdomens. The red-eyed in particular has a really dark top to its thorax, and the abdomen, although it's dark mostly, does have this waxy pruinescence, so this pale blue colouring coming through and making it look a little bit greyish rather than solid black in the red-eyed. But notice the red-eyed has two completely blue segments right at the tip, so not a segment back as in the case of the bluetail, for example. The small red-eye, very similar, later emerging, so present in big numbers in August, September. The red-eyed present in big numbers in June, July and into August. But look at the detail of the tip of the abdomen. There's an extra bit of blue on the side of the 8th segment, a sort of wedge of blue that's quite clearly seen with a good view through binoculars. Slender abdomen, it's a slimmer, smaller damselfly than the red-eye. And on top of the last segment of the abdomen, there's a black marking, which you can sometimes see from the side, but usually best seen from above. And there, for comparison, although a little bit shrunk in size, is the red-eyed damselfly. So look at the difference in the pattern of blue at the tip of the abdomen. Emerald damselflies break the rule. So I said right at the beginning that damselflies hold all their wings together over their abdomen. Well, the one that typically doesn't is the emerald damselfly. And you can see here both the male at the front and the female there that is actually about to lay eggs are shown with their wings out at about 60 degrees. So the male, this one quite fresh, bright emerald green, shiny, with powder blue markings at the tip of the abdomen and at the base of the abdomen, and also around its thorax, underneath its thorax. And nice blue eyes too. Big wing spots, big rectangular dark wing spots. Females are a rather bronzy green. They get bronzier as they get older, but they start off quite fresh, iridescent green, shiny green and creamy coloured underneath, with a big ovipositor. They use that to lay eggs into plant material, typically above the water, so into a stem like this rush here. They need something quite robust to cut into that, so they have a big ovipositor. There we are, the powder blue areas on the male. So let's move on now to dragonflies. So the first emerger, typically in April, and on the wing during May and into June, the hairy dragonfly is a small, brightly coloured, well-patterned hawker, not often seen perched and typically seen patrolling low down over the water along the edges of vegetation, reed beds, on the edge of the emergent plants on the side of the lake or the ponds. Broad-bodied chaser does what it says on the tin. Both males and females have a broad abdomen, and chasers have dark wing bases, which are really big in the case of the broad-bodied. For spotted chaser, both males and females unusually are the same colour, same pattern. The 4 spots in the name comes from these black spots at the nodes, so halfway along the wing they have an extra black spot. Dark wing bases, as I said, makes them a chaser. The downy emerald, male and female, also look similar, but you don't very often see females. This is a male with a rather wasted abdomen, so quite narrow towards the base and then bulging towards the tip. So it has what I technically call a blobby tip, dark bronzy green colour, bright bronzy green thorax, and then even brighter emerald green eyes, usually seen in flight, patrolling the water's edge. By midsummer, we've started to get emperors present over the lake and around all the smaller ponds, males patrolling constantly. They will emerge during May and we'll be finding their exuviae, certainly by the end of May. Black-tailed skimmers will have been emerging towards the end of May and flying strongly during midsummer. The males perched on bare ground on the edges of the lake and ponds and on the boardwalks. Keeled skimmer, the smaller version of the black-tailed without a black tail, but the keeled males we will see in very small numbers at a couple of the ponds, so one of the scarce species. And then towards the end of summer, common darters start to become very obvious. Maybe starting in July, but certainly August, September and even into October, sometimes into November. The common darter, the latest of the species, a medium-sized dragonfly, a percher, and the males orangey red in colour, females ochre yellow. The southern hawker also occurs in late summer and comes and patrols the waters into the autumn. Very colourful and rather smaller, almost as colourful I guess, the migrant hawker, and that's a rather slimmer version of a hawker, but another flyer, one that will patrol endlessly and will be hard to see perched. So let's So here's the hairy dragonfly male. We can see he's got quite a hairy thorax. That is an adaptation that several of the spring emerging species have. Helps them to warm up quickly during the cooler weather in the spring. And here's a pair mating, so you can see the female lacks the blue coloration usually and is dark brown and yellow. They both have rather nice yellow veins in the wings. The costa at the front of the wing is yellow. The wing spot is orangey brown, and they have little yellow antinodal veins, they're called, across the front of the wing, those tiny little veins. The broad-bodied chaser, as I said earlier, lives up to its name. It has a very broad abdomen, turning powder blue in the males. Dark wing bases. All the chasers have dark wing bases, more or less, most extensive in the broad-bodied chaser. And then the female broad-bodied chaser and the young males, when they first emerge, will look this rather bright yellowy colour, yellowy spots on the sides of the abdomen, and then the dark wing bases again. This one incidentally has rather deformed hind wings. It's not uncommon to see that in dragonflies and damselflies. If it's very bad, then they're unable to fly, but this female was quite able to fly, albeit probably not perfectly. The four-spotted chaser, as I said earlier, has the dark wing bases of a chaser, and it has the extra spots on the wings that gives it its name. Brown coloration in both males and females, and quite downy. Again, this one will be seen on the wing in May, June. And sometimes you see them with extra black areas towards the wingtips and rather more coloration in the wings. As the summer progresses, they do become rather dull, dark, dingy brown creatures, but they retain those extra black wing spots. Perchers, like the broad-bodied chaser, so you'll see these perched around the edges of the lake and the ponds. Downy emerald, another spring emerging species, so it's downy on the thorax, helps it to warm up in the spring. And we can see those lovely bright green eyes and thorax, which really shine in the sun if you see them close. And they will come and hover in front of you if you're lucky, around the edge of the lake, whilst they're looking for a female to grab hold of and mate with. But the real characteristics of these when they're in flight is this blobby tip to the abdomen, which they tend to hold slightly above the horizontal. Here's a close-up of a male, that same male in fact, showing those green eyes and thorax. And there's a male in flight, not easy to capture photographically, but we can see there that blobby tip. Emperor dragonfly is our bulkiest dragonfly. It has the biggest wingspan. A very powerful flyer, will fly for seemingly hours on end. It will feed on the wing, so even while it's holding territory over a pond, it may still grab a passing butterfly and nip its wings off and eat the juicy bits as it's flying around. It has blue sides to the abdomen, which are very conspicuous when you see it in flight, and a dark line right down the middle. And the thorax is a plain green colour, so no black markings to speak of on the thorax. Here's a male patrolling. We can see it's got a yellow wing vein at the front. The costa is yellow, but we can see that rather plain green thorax and quite a lot of blue visible along the side of the abdomen, and often a slightly droopy abdomen, bending down almost as though it's a bit too heavy to carry around, and typically flying at around shoulder or waist height, so between 1 and 2 meters above the water, so flying quite high. Contrast that with the hairy dragonfly that we saw earlier, which apart from being much smaller, will often be only 20 or 30 centimeters above the water surface, so flying really quite low down. Golden ringed patrols up and down territories along streams. This is the male, the female, similarly patterned with both broad and narrow yellow bands around the abdomen, and lovely green eyes. And there's the female with her long ovipositor that actually makes her the longest British dragonfly species. Not common at Stover, usually seen along the Ventiford Brook if at all, or occasionally perched in some of the heathy areas around the lake. Black-tailed skimmer can be quite a common sight during the summer. Males on territory around the edges of the lake and ponds, perched on bare ground, on wood, on mud, rarely perched on vegetation, though usually right on the ground. The males have a black tip to the abdomen, which of course gives it the name black-tailed skimmer. But until their blue pruinescence, that waxy substance, has come through on the abdomen, they look like the females. Sorry, I should have mentioned that skimmers lack the black wing bases that chasers have. But there's a female. The males are patterned similarly when they first emerge, and they have basically two dark parallel lines down the abdomen, looking rather like a ladder, and eventually the male will become blue, and that patterning will disappear. Greenish eyes on a black-tailed skimmer. And skimmers also, like the hairy dragonfly, but the characteristic of all skimmers is the yellow antinodal veins, these little veins. Keeled skimmer, as I said earlier, is a rather scarce species, usually associated with bog moss, so sphagnum moss around the edges of ponds. So then they're usually boggy, acidic ponds on heathland. So we do have a couple of ponds which are suitable at Stover, and we do have a small number of them there most years. Usually seeing the males perched low on vegetation on the edge of a pond. So the males lacking the dark tip to the abdomen. Both male and female, especially the female, have this dark line down the centre of the abdomen, which is the keel. Plain wing bases, so no chaser-like dark wing bases. There's the so-called keel that gives it its name, not really a very good field mark. And the females have slightly more conspicuous dark spots or markings either side of the keel, which differentiate it from the female darters, common darters, that are much more common. But notice those yellow antinodal veins on the female and the orangey wing spots. Here's a male common darter in his mature colours. So although they may start off yellowish, they will soon turn orangey and then reddish as they mature. and at this time they will have two yellow panels on the side of their thorax. Brownish legs, usually with a little bit of a paler yellowy stripe visible. Rather dull brown top of the thorax and eyes. So some of these features will help us to spot the common darter as opposed to the ruddy darter, which is a local rarity. Common darters like heat. As I mentioned, they can be around into the autumn, even into November at times, and then they definitely like to bask, so they find warm places, including human beings. So this is really just to summarize how variable the colour can be on common darters, and indeed reflected in other species too. So at the top we have both male on the left and female on the right, immature or teneral common darters. So this is what they look like, say in the first few days after they've emerged. And then as time goes by, the males will become red, orangey red. Females may go rather dull brown, grey-brown even when they're old. And then when they're even older, some females may go red in colour, but pretty unusual to see that. And then the wings in males may start to get a little bit of coloration, slight ochre coloration, yellowish tint to the wings, and the abdomen may go a little bit pinkish. Southern hawker, one of our large and most colourful dragonflies, quite inquisitive. Territorial males will often come and hover in front of you if you stand still, and then you get a chance to see their diagnostic features. So they have what I call headlights. So these big yellow patches at the top of the thorax and two completely blue areas across the tip of the abdomen. So rather than just paired spots, these merge and become two completely blue areas on the males. Here's a male in flight, so you can see both headlights and tail lights on the male quite easily in flight. Quite a lot of colour on the side of the thorax as well, quite a lot of yellow showing. The female, rather attractive chocolate brown and lime coloured almost, certainly a greenish yellow coloration, but with the same headlights and tail lights as the male. Here we can see a female laying eggs. Hawkers lay eggs around the side of ponds usually, and often into rotten wood or debris, moss as well. So here's a female laying into a rotten log. We can see her on the left quite clearly, her headlights. The migrant hawker, rather smaller, you will often see a number of them together. They're less territorial than the southern hawker, which will fight off other males in defence of his territory. So migrant hawkers you'll sometimes see dozens of in one area. They go into emergent vegetation, so into reed beds. They'll fly amongst the vegetation looking for females. The females will be laying eggs into the stems of these plants, these emergent plants. So the migrant hawker has really not a lot going for it by way of headlights. It has its side lights on, and ditto at the rear end, it's got side lights there, so nothing like the bright tail lights going straight across of the southern hawker. And here's a migrant hawker in profile, and we can see quite a lot of brown as well as yellow on the side of the thorax. And these, when they hover, which they often do, Sometimes persistently they will hover. They will hold their abdomen up tilted at the rear end. So quite a good feature on the migrant hawker. Migrant hawker, the latest species of dragonfly to emerge, not appearing before the end of July, and these will be flying well into the autumn, into October, possibly November.